Well, welcome everyone to session one of our newest, latest, I hope greatest Bible study. It's a 6-week or a 6-session class on Moses, and Moses as a character more than sort of Moses as the figure of biblical history. And I'll go into that a little bit. But why do a class on Moses? We did Exodus. Gosh, when I forgot to look at the dates, it was at least 6 years ago, probably more like 8 years ago that we went through the book of Exodus, and it was a lot of fun. And so we obviously talked about Moses, but why do a Bible study specifically on Moses? Well, you may know already that Moses is the single most important character in the entire Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament. It is, aside from his story, the way he connects to the freeing of the Israelites from slavery, it's the central story of Israel's entire identity. You've got all these Jewish festivals that continue to this day that are attributed to Moses. So you've got the festival of tabernacles, which is called Sukkot. You've got Shavuot, which is the festival of weeks. You have Passover. The Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, is attributed to Moses. You've got Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. All these holidays, these festivals, are rooted in the story of Moses. He is just so central, and he is also central to a Christian understanding. More than 70 times he is mentioned in the New Testament. And so much in the gospel stories is sort of a recapitulation, illustration of who Moses is in the person of Jesus, or who Moses was. So you have the story of Jesus in Matthew about the flight to Egypt. That's Moses. That's taking that story and kind of connecting Jesus to being the new Moses. You've got the stories of the Sermon on the Mount. You've got many texts in the Gospel of John, many of the things that Jesus says and does around the Passion story and the Last Supper and the crucifixion, all connected to Moses. Deep, deep connections. So it is understandable that we'd want to look at him as a character. And it's also important to sort of think about, when these stories were originally shared, the Moses stories, they would have been shared orally. The texts that we have written down were most likely written in the time of exile in Babylon. That is the most agreed upon, kind of time of writing for these stories. Why? Because that was the time when they were under threat, and they were worried that they would lose these stories, so they wrote them down. But previous to that, it was all oral. Most of the people within Israel would not have been literate, so oral tradition is the way you did it. And they told these stories. The intent was to entertain on one level. They had to be entertaining stories, but they were also the kind of stories that kind of helped shape their sense of identity, who they were. And it also taught them about the will of God for them and for all of humanity. So they really served a lot of purpose. And when we read a lot of these stories, and let's face it, when we read a lot of the Bible stories, we tend to get all solemn about it and serious. But the truth is, my tact, and a lot of folks, when we're teaching these stories, think about them more as campfire stories or even bedtime stories, okay? Stories with clear heroes and villains, stories with a lot of suspense and intrigue, and absolutely a lot of humor, okay? So what this raises for us is something, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I do want to reference it, and that is, there is not a lot of agreement as to whether or not Moses was an actual historical figure.
Oh.
There's a lot of question about that. Now, we may or may not believe that's true. I personally believe he was, but I look at these stories as not necessarily being reflective of a historical account. They are more, think of them more like the Arthurian legends, or maybe the Iliad and the Odyssey. or I should say, that's one approach to looking at these stories. And the reason I talk about it like this is because those types of stories, the Iliad, the Odyssey, they are conveying deep truth and a sense of identity of culture, but they're not necessarily rooted in history the way we think of it. But it makes them no less true. And this is kind of one of the ongoing metaphorical conundrums of understanding Bible story. And that is, if we make it all about the literal truth, then we miss the whole point of the story of, say, Noah, and we spend all our energy trying to find where Mount Ararat is so we can find the wreckage of the ark. And we miss the entire point. So I invite us to consider whether or not we think Moses was a historical figure, or whether or not we think that all of these events happened this way, because the truth is there's not agreement within scholarship as to the fact that was there a large group of people that was enslaved in Egypt that would have been Israel. There's some evidence that there were Semitic people there, absolutely. It was a major trade route. It was a place where people always came. That was the fertile part of the Fertile Crescent. There were a lot of people traveling through. But there's not evidence that the events described here happened exactly this way. But as I always try to say, and as the ancient storytellers say, the point of these stories is, I don't know whether or not it actually happened this way, but I know this is true. Mm-hmm. And that's our approach. It conveys something of truth, because when we look at Moses, the character as presented in these stories, he is wonderful. He is the most reluctant, unwilling participant in all the things that God asks him to do. He is an old shepherd who is called out of his work in the desert to all of a sudden be the greatest prophet in the history of Israel. He's a murderer who's running from the law. He has a speech impediment, apparently, based on the way the story is told about him. And yet he becomes this incredible leader. All of these characteristics make him so relatable, and I think even lovable. And that's where I find that will be more of our focus in this class, is looking at Moses as character, Moses as personality presented in these stories, to find out how his story speaks to us and how we relate to our own calls to God and all the things that God calls us to do and be out of our places of, running and hiding and all that stuff. How do we connect to the story of Moses? And that, I believe, is quite rich. So today we're going to be starting off, with kind of that introduction and going into his birth story a little bit, understanding, the way fear and courage and trust kind of played through these texts that I hope have already read, but we'll be reading out loud. You will see that. And we'll see how these initial stories, how they illustrate the ways God tends to work in our world. And I think that'll be instructive too. So again, the whole point is, as we look at the story of Moses, and, the book of Deuteronomy, with all his faults and with all the fact that he never got to actually see the promised land or go into it, I think he got to the mountaintop kind of thing. The way Deuteronomy ends, the book of Deuteronomy ends, it says, no prophet like Moses has yet emerged in Israel. Moses knew the Lord face to face. And it's really just a beautiful sense of intimate connection. And so I guess I would say that one of the intentions of doing a class like that is, by looking at Moses more closely, the one who saw God face to face, perhaps it will draw us to a closer relationship with God, that we might also learn more about the face of God as present all around us. So with that, I'd love to just hear about any kind of thoughts or questions you have about Moses or about anything I just said. I heard some reaction. I know that's sometimes it can be a lot to dump information like that, but let's just see if there's anything percolating now before we get into the readings and the other parts of the class. Marilyn, and then Bonnie.
Dan, I'm so glad that you mentioned metaphor and truth, because if you're a person who's studied things from a literature standpoint, then one of the things, at least that I learned about metaphor, is that it's often used to convey truth better than it would be able to do it by just laying out, sort of the facts or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's what I really love about thinking about these stories in the Bible as metaphor. It's not that it takes anything away from them, it adds to them. It adds to our appreciation.
I couldn't agree more. It allows an expression of richness that simple explanation or sort of delineation just cannot capture. And yet, I think if we're honest, we often try to do that with the stories, or we were raised in traditions that try to do that. And having said that, I think it still can be helpful, because anything can be our teacher, whether we're walking into it and we sort of understand it a certain way, or we were raised to see it another way and we bumped into some walls about that. It's all helpful. It can all be instructive to us. But for our purposes, yes, we will stay connected to these stories in their metaphorical connection to truth, perhaps more than worrying about the historical aspects. Bonnie, did you have any comments too?
Yeah, my comment was more about the actual reading. I think we're all familiar with the story of the baby Moses, the bulrushes, Pharaoh's daughter, and all of that. But I had never read the verses before that.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know anything about the midwives that Pharaoh had instructed them to kill the infants, and that they lied and said, oh, well, Jewish women are different and they go into labor before we get there. And I was like, wait, I never got that. And how many years have I heard this story? It was in a children's Bible story book when I was very young, and you hear it your whole life. And it's like, that part was always left out. So that was something new for me. And then the other thing that really struck me that I had never thought about was, because I do this genealogy, and a lot of my mother's family, unfortunately, were slaveholders. Ancestors were slaveholders. And so I've read many wills where they're willing their slaves and all their offspring, even though they aren't born yet. They really wanted them to multiply. They wanted the slaves to multiply because it was more money, et cetera, et cetera. But here it was just the exact opposite. Like the slaves were multiplying, and it's like, oh no, we don't want that, because they're creating problems. They're getting stronger than we are. And I thought that is the exact opposite of how, at least my experience with my limited knowledge of slaveholders are.
I think you're so on it with these comments, Bonnie. Thank you. Yes, the first thing you said is I always find this happening to me as well. How many times I have known and read these stories, whether it's a sermon or whether it's Bible study on a personal level, but then even coming into this week to read those words that you referenced again was very much eye-opening and expanded my whole sense of this story. And we will come back to that. But yes, excellent observation. And then secondarily, I do think it can be instructive to consider some of those ways, the anecdotal experience, but I also think it's reflected in some of the history, certainly within this country, of slavery, where there was an encouragement of what you said, kind of be fruitful and multiply for the sake of economics. But in this story, it's Pharaoh distinctly pulling back the reins. And what might be the purpose of telling a story like that? And we can explore that. I don't know that I'll explicitly get into that today, but I'll try to leave room as we go through what we read and see if anything comes up, because that's the way these stories work. Things beyond what I've intended to talk about will come up. So we'll get to wander through the wilderness of Moses, in many ways. Anyone else? Marcia?
Just quick. Were the Jews historically enslaved in Egypt? Is that true?
Well, that's what I was saying. There's no agreed upon evidence. There are some things, I should say this, there's no universally agreed upon evidence that there is ever any large group as described like these stories that existed like that. Plus, And it's funny because it doesn't say this in the Bible, but a lot of people have this idea that Pharaoh used the Hebrew slaves to help build the pyramids. That is a complete. Now, many people understand that the pyramids were built long before Israel would have been in the picture, but the Pharaoh commonly used slaves to do that. It just wasn't necessarily the Hebrew slaves. And the fact that, you know, if the story is like this, it's just there's a lot of problems with it potentially. So all I can say is that it is not agreed that this is a historical reality. There's no evidence of 40 years of wandering, you know, or of anything left by any people wandering through the wilderness kind of thing. There's just not a lot. But okay, having said that, it doesn't rule it out. It just means that there's question. And so it invites us into that space. That's why I kind of did the introduction I did. It's like, let's pull back. And, you know, reading with a historical, factual lens can be instructive, but it's often pretty narrow. So let's pull back and look at it more metaphorically and sort of see how this might play. It's sort of like how we tell stories. I mentioned, you know, we all know the story of George Washington and the cherry tree. Okay, didn't happen, wasn't based in history, and yet it was true because it speaks to the values of honesty, integrity, and hard work that we as Americans valued then and still value today. And it conveys that truth, okay, through the vehicle of one who we esteem almost universally, George Washington. So we use these stories to tell deep truth, whether or not it's factually accurate, because we all understand that it doesn't really matter if you cut down the cherry tree. What matters is that is who we are. Okay, these stories attempt to describe who are we using language, much like Marilyn said, that's like bigger than just here's what he did. And, you know, it's sort of, if that's how these stories were written, it'd be like being in US history class in high school. Okay, we'd be all falling asleep and just writing down dates and facts and that's not it. That's not what these stories were meant to be. And forgive me if any of you was a history teacher and you didn't teach like that, but that is unfortunately the trope, I suppose. And it's unfortunate the way we teach some of our classes especially in terms of history, but nonetheless, that will be our approach. Peter, and then Ken.
Considering that most of these festivities and observances that describe the Jewish people took place during Exodus and before, was there a defined Jewish people?
That is an excellent
prior
question.
to Moses. Or was this a group of what we would call pagans who had some celebrations or ceremonies that became galvanized?
I can say this. This is what's hard, Peter. This is where you're touching on something that's hard, because these stories, to the best of our knowledge, were only written down way after the fact. Okay, so this is the perspective of those who wrote these stories is from an established Israel. Okay, but they're looking back in what I would contend are legendary ways to describe and self-understand their relationship to cultures around them and their relationship to their God. So it's very difficult to answer that because yes, there was, you know, there had to have been a people, but there's certainly Semitic people before that, but not, I agree with you that what it asks, or what it begs the question, Israel didn't exist in the way we know it prior to Moses or prior to these described events. Now, these events, again, if they're not historical, if they are, one way or another, there was the creation and a self-understanding of a new special relationship to each other and the tribes of Israel and to God that was shaped by these stories. That's about all I can say. But you're absolutely right. You're raising the questions that are like, whoa, so did they exist? Well, If the stories of Abraham are about, sort of anything historical, then yes. But if those are legendary stories, then we don't know quite how to answer that. Because all we have is a self-understanding of a people that happened arguably in the time of Babylon, which is only 7th century, BCE. And we're talking, this is thousands of years before that. These are all oral stories. So I don't know. I hope that responded to the question, but it's hard. It's hard. Ken?
What impressed me in rereading the story is that the promised land was somebody else's land. It was
Yeah.
very, very, very clear. There are other people, this was their land, a number of different peoples.
That's right.
And yet this was being promised to them.
Exactly. And this is what you see when you look through the stories of Joshua and the actual conquering, the so-called conquering of the promised land. When you look at those stories themselves historically, and you see that's the fulfillment of these promises that we're seeing in Exodus, what you understand historically is that most of these towns that they're describing were long either leveled, lost, uninhabited, all these different things. So that's where sometimes if we force history onto these stories, we really are just kind of entering in a space into this understanding that just doesn't give us a lot of fruit. But if we allow them to be metaphorical and we allow these people to understand, oh, this is what God was sort of saying. So maybe the story of the fall of Jericho is not a literal marching around, that sort of thing. Maybe there's something else about how when God leads, this is how things happen. There's a lot more to it. We're not covering Joshua, but yes, you are talking about a whole. Israel was established in the midst of an already well-established set of cultures around them. And so that's what makes it fascinating. They went from basically a nomadic people to a people who had a land. And that, as you probably also know, in your lifetime, with the reestablishment or the establishment of the state of Israel in, what was it, 1952? It was post World War II, obviously, but it hasn't been that long. So it's important for a sense of identity. They go from identity, connection to our God through the rules and our food and the way we, our circumcision, those identities, to then identifying to God through land and through place and through temple. You see the difference? But that's sort of, it's connected to the Moses story, but the Moses story is sort of just the beginning kernel of that self-understanding that moves them from nomadic people to established people, one way or another. Any other comments? This is great. It's good, rich conversation to get us into this awesome character. All right, then let's go ahead and we'll read the portions from chapter 1 and 2 of Exodus. I think they're a little bit long, but let's just take 2 readers. I think that'd be sufficient. So if I could get 2 volunteers to read the portions that we have. Boyce, do I see your hand up? I don't, but oh, there it is. Okay, so Horty, and I didn't mean to call you out, Boyce, but are you up for it?
Oh, I guess.
Look at that.
Not really.
Show up late, I'll get you.
The reluctant prophet.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's perfect. Stay in that role, Boyce. All right, Horty, I'm going to have you read the chapter. I'll have Horty read chapter 1, and then Boyce, you read the chapter 2 one, if you would.
All right.
Okay. Go for it, Horty.
Muting, yes, find your
Oh, there
details.
you go.
Okay, there we go. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase. And in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that Egyptians Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians subjected the Israelites to hard servitude and made their lives bitter with hard servitude in mortar and bricks and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them.
The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah. When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on a birth stool, never heard of a birth stool. If it is a son, kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women were not like the Egyptian women, but they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live."
Dun, dun. All right. Well, my intention
did
with
I
that
read?
was to have you read Exodus 2, boys, but that's okay. You guys, that sounded great. So this isn't super long, but if you could just continue. This is Exodus 2, 1 to 10.
You want me to continue?
Yes, I do. That's what I asked you to read. Yes.
Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she called a papyrus maid. Oh, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it along the reeds of the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the Pharaoh went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to the Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water."
Okay. And boys, could you read the next chapter? I'm just kidding. You were
And lo
wonderful.
and behold,
You were wonderful.
there was a great light above, and Moses became
Oh,
one of the
So
sons
much-
of the Pharaoh.
yes. So much good stuff in there.
And
I
Moses-
mean, can you just feel how this is like, it just reads like a campfire story. It's so fun. It's so interesting, so much intrigue. It just works as an oral story. It just works. But before we get into most of those details of the story, I want to key in on that very first line that Horty read from verse 8, I think it was verse 8 of chapter 1, where it says, "There was a time when the Pharaoh did not know Joseph." Why does it start with that? Or who was Joseph anyway? And why is that connected to Moses? This is a quiz, basically, to see what we remember about who Joseph is and why that's important. Bonnie, what can you say?
Well, Joseph was sold into slavery, I believe, by his older brothers. And through the course of time, he became favored, and he was the one that was more or less in charge of all the distribution of all the food and so forth. And so then when his brothers came to him, I don't recall if they first recognized him or if they later recognized him, but they were asking him for food, and then they had to sort of bow down to him, which must have been somewhat humiliating after they had thrown him, overboard essentially. But anyway, he became this great leader, and he was now, since Peter mentioned what he mentioned, I'm confused, but I always thought he was Jewish. I always thought they were all Jewish. So anyway.
Oh, we can call them that. We can call them that. Yes, for the sake of clarity, let's call them Jewish or Hebrew. Their identity would have been there. They just were likely a nomadic people at that time. They would have had their identity one way or another. And that was why they were so focused on those their own food laws, their purity laws, and it explains why they never wanted people to have babies with foreign women, because they needed to preserve bloodlines. That's all they had. To be Jewish was very specific back then. Anyway, we don't want to get too much into that, but yeah, nice job recasting. I mean, there are some little details in there, and this is what happens. There's so many different characters. But yeah, great job saying recapping the story of Joseph. Does anyone have anything else to add or maybe tweak on it?
I just have a question. When did the 12 tribes become named after the 12, Joseph and his brothers?
Well, we don't know exactly. We know that if these stories were written in the time of the Babylonian, like the whole Torah was written during the time, written down like this. So these stories would have been oral, but it's referenced to being back in the time of Abraham. So it may well have been for a good number of generations prior to this story of Moses, but it's just very difficult to tell. Horty, anything else to add to the Joseph story? Or yeah, and then Carol?
I was always just struck by the importance that Joseph had to the Pharaoh. And that's what I read into the beginning of this, that he was highly trusted and he was really valued. And he did a great job of multiplying what the Pharaoh had. He was a good steward. And so that was part of his importance to the Pharaoh. So the story begins with a time without that relationship happening. It makes it a little bit less, this happened because of this. It's a little more, it makes it a little bit more isolated in terms of the importance of how Moses came into being.
Well, and what you'll see is repeated patterns of how success happens within the story of Israel. It is most often with shrewdness, wisdom, tenacity, and a little bit of luck. So Joseph embodies that. But look at the story of Abraham and Abram and Sarah. All of these stories have a certain level of shrewdness. Remember when Abraham lied and said that his wife was his sister in order to save people? Yes. So there's shrewdness. Joseph was very wise. Remember, he was a dream interpreter. So that's how Pharaoh came to appreciate his wisdom. He interpreted Pharaoh's dreams when no one else could. So he worked his way in there, and effectively he was adopted by Pharaoh into the Pharaoh family. Notice that little pattern that Moses fits right into. So these are some of the things, but we see patterns. But yes, this is what's happened. One way or another, Joseph went from nothing to being sold into slavery by his brothers. If you remember, he was the son of Jacob and Rebekah, and he was his father's favorite. And his brothers were super jealous of him because what did his father give him? That wonderful special coat. We call it the coat of many colors. It's a special coat. He was the favored son and they couldn't stand him. And then he told him about the dream he had. Remember, that was the whole bow down dream. And his brother said, enough with this guy. Let's kill him. And they say, no, let's sell him off to slave traders. And so they do. And he goes to Egypt, and then that's where he sort of works his way into the favored status with Pharaoh. Carol, I didn't mean to step on anything you wanted to add. Do you have anything else you wanted to contribute?
No,
there?
that's what I was going to say. Watch out. You never know what someone will become.
Yes.
Just
and
Joseph and Moses.
that's what these stories are so much about, right? That theme right there. Think about how many times that's repeated. You never know what God can do with you. Sarah laughs because she's too old to have children. Moses is basically the anti-hero, as we'll go through his story. Everything about him is just like not what you think as the one who will be what he becomes. Joseph, same thing. Cast aside into a pit, goes to the land of their so-called enemy, but finds a way. And that's the way God works. That's what these stories are trying to tell us. This is how God works in the world. God makes a way where we see nothing. Okay, that's what these stories are trying to tell us. Any other just thoughts on Joseph and why that's connected to Moses? Ken?
Well, I think it's interesting that Joseph's family comes down to Egypt because of the drought, but they don't come down as slaves. But over time, they fall into servitude somehow.
Yes, exactly. Well, and that's the point. You're right. Because when they arrive, Joseph has this favored status, and they do come because of famine in Israel or in their land at that time. Again, because these stories are written way later, they will reference the existence of Israel and Israelites, but historically that's where we have questions. But anyway, when their brothers arrive to see Joseph, they can settle in the land. They're not settling at that time as slaves because Joseph, with his favored status, is able to do that for them. And that right there is why this story starts off by saying, but then there came a time when Pharaoh didn't know Joseph. Okay, that's sort of an ominous shift, okay, into this next portion of the narrative. But it's important to think about, and to just on a general level, the connection that Joseph has to Moses. And really all of these stories that are presented in Genesis and in Exodus have connection like that. There are bloodlines that run through them, okay? And that's how they work. So what you see then, after that, is you see Pharaoh responding, primarily in verses 8 to 14 in chapter 1 there. And where Pharaoh sees what's going on and with the Israelite population, and he responds to it. Okay. And we just read what his response was. And as you think about that response, and you know what, I can call up here, let me just go back to that so you can actually look at the text again in chapter 1. So the verse numbers aren't here, but as you see, this whole first section here, really, it starts to talk about it. His response to the growth of the Israel people is as such. And it makes me wonder, in your, how does this correlate to today? What are some examples from your own lifetime that you can think of, okay, where, let's say, a fear of a minority population has led a powerful nation, whether this one or another, to oppress, dehumanize, or at times even attempt to eradicate by genocide another people. Can you think of any examples? I don't mean to make light, but I phrased the question in a way that I think we all can recognize. This is not a new pattern, is it? Barbara, what did you want to say?
We can't hear you, Barbara.
I know.
She knows. I think I can see her kind of.
I was just thinking he wanted an actual answer, and my answer was the American Indians.
Yes.
The Native Americans. We did that to them. We genocided them.
Yes.
For sure.
And we do that by a process of dehumanizing, to make it more acceptable to do that. And that's really how it works. So obviously we have the Holocaust, the Nazi Germany, but yes, Native Americans, what happened to the Japanese in World War II here in this area?
African American
people, that impacted. We had all those early 20th century anti-immigration laws that sort of restricted people
Yes,
coming in from
yes.
certain unaccepted areas and encouraged the certain others to come in, these types of things. And we know all these examples. But the point is that response of power to minority and the way that the stamp that of sort of using force to try to stamp it out, that is not a new system. And what does it say though? It sort of illustrates that there was this lack of control. Like the way that this story characterizes the Israel people, it's like Pharaoh is trying to flex his muscles and yet you just can't stop him. That's the difference. God finds a way that these people are still multiplying. And that's what's scary. That's what's scary to Pharaoh in this instance. He's trying to wield power and control, and he's being foiled by things outside of his control. And that theme is another one that is constant throughout all the scriptures. When worldly power seeks to wield its might, ultimately God has the last word. And not meeting might with might, most often anyway, not meeting might with might, but meeting it with something completely different. Okay, meeting it with, well, I don't know, characters like in this story. Okay, so let's look at some of that. As you think about those two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, okay, what they do, the ones, because Pharaoh, he says to them, here's what you do. When you see the woman on the birth stool, if it's a boy, and they say, this is possibly the first recorded act of civil disobedience. Really? Mm-hmm. And how many of us, when we've read this story before, saw it that way? It's kind of like these characters are much more central to the story, to the workings of the story, than perhaps we ever gave credit to or realized. So one of the questions I think it makes us consider or helps us consider is, have you ever been faced with two competing moral claims like they were? You know, they had the moral claim on them from Pharaoh, their master, and yet it also says they feared God. They had another understanding, and they responded out of what they perceived to be and what was the higher calling. Have you had to walk that walk of dealing with two competing moral claims on you? And how did you handle it? What did you do? How did you decide in that instance? Anyone, does anything come up for anyone? When I was in go ahead, Kathleen.
Well, I'm just thinking of over the years, maybe 45 years ago, my feelings on homosexuality. And I don't remember thinking that it was sinful, but that it wasn't correct. I'm going to just try to be politic in my vocabulary. And then Harry's sister is gay, and it changed completely our perspective, because we thought, my goodness, this is a wonderful person. And it really changed our perspective, and thinking that we know God loves her, and that God loves her just how she is. So that was a challenge for a while, but this was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And anyway, and there have been others similar, but I do know that I can change. Perry and I both can change. Yeah, and we have to be allowed to change and allow others to change.
Oh, of course. And it was because you had a story and a person and something right in front of you that was competing with all that stuff you were taught, that was just sort of like from the ether or from other opinions and perspectives and put in your head. And so that was a competing claim. The one I was going to share was something similar. When I told my aunt when I was in college that I was going to work at the Worcester AIDS Project as a buddy for men who were dying at that time with AIDS, because it was 1992. And I was still at a time where no one really knew if you touched someone who has AIDS, if you would get it, that sort of thing. You know, that was when Magic Johnson had just announced and everyone was sort of, so I did that because I was afraid, but also because my aunt, who is much more of a fundamentalist Christian, said, I hope that when you go there, you will preach the gospel to them. And I knew what she meant. I knew what she meant. That it was more along the lines of what you were saying, Kathleen, that there was this lack of fundamental acceptance of who they were, that there was something wrong with them that needed to be healed or purged or something like that. And I said, no, I will preach. I will go there and I will be with them and I will love them, because that's what I see is needed, because these are people that people don't even want to touch. These are the lepers. I didn't say it like that, but that was my self-understanding, you know, in looking back. And it just became one of those that was a competing, that I said, I feel that I moved to respond to the ones that are more on the margin. The voice that would easily be squelched, you know, that sort of thing. So that was that for me too. Sort of a similar movement there. Others with this, have you had time to other examples? Horty?
The grammar school that I went to was very interracial. We had Japanese folks and Chinese folks and Black folks and Indonesian folks. And I remember some folks from Egypt, and it was kind of an international school somehow. And these were all just my friends. I'd known most of them since kindergarten. And my family lived across the street from the school. So it was not uncommon after school for kids to gather on our front steps and just kind of hang and visit for a little while. And my father called me into his office and he said, I don't want you hanging out there with that N-word. My folks being from the South. And I was appalled. And I stood up from where I was sitting. And I think I must have been about 12, maybe, feels like it. And we were not allowed to say no to our parents about anything ever. Our folks were very strict.
Right.
And I stood up and I said, don't you ever, ever, ever use that word in front of me again. And I turned around and walked out. And I knew lightning was going to strike me dead. I knew that he was going to come after me and spank the bejesus out of me. He never did. He never raised his voice. He never called me back into the room. And I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified, but I absolutely would not let that happen. I just would not. These are my friends. These are my buddies. I've known these people for 5 or 6 or 7 years. No, this is not right. And it was the first time really I confronted what I knew were my parents' beliefs in a really open and personally terrifying way.
Yes, absolutely it is. And for you who had that courage, and for all of us who as kids didn't find that power until later to stand up and speak like that, I just honor all of that. And once again, what we have is competing interests of things, beliefs that were planted in our head from someone else, and the experience of life and of our heart and where they meet. And it sounds like when we operate so far, these examples, when we operate from out of that heart place, when we trust that, we can move through some of these. But those are really powerful. That's a really powerful example. And you took a risk. And much like Pua and Shifra in this story, took a significant risk. I mean, I think we know that if they had gotten caught, or if they had, that story they told was one that there could have been lots of ways that that fell apart, right? And I think we understand that there would not have been much leniency at that time. These people were not, the midwives were not high up on the social ladder. Okay, so that was some significant risk. And it makes me think, you know, these stories that have been shared so far, they all involve some level of risk. You know, when we stand up in these ways, it puts us in a position of risk and even jeopardy. Okay, and so how do we manage that? Is that our call to stand up and put ourselves at risk? Is that one of the ways we can decide what the right thing is? If it's safe or if it's risky?
Well,
Marty?
I think that the answer is yes and no. That sometimes the lesson comes from taking the risk and facing the stark terror. And sometimes the risk comes in backing down from that, cowering, and then examining who you are as that cowering person, and then coming to a place of wisdom of, oh, I might have done that differently. So I think for me anyway, the answer is yes and no, because have I cowered at times? Of course.
Yeah. Oh, that's all of us. And again, that's one of the reasons Moses is such a powerful character, is because he embodies all of that. When we risk for love, though, when we take risks for love, or when we take risks to confront fear, that's where God tends to show up. That's where these types of decisions tend to really make shifts in our lives. These are growing points, you know, for all of us. When you tell stories like this, these are markers. These mark a significant change in your whole sense of identity in your life. These are big. These are big moments, you know, and we all have them. When we stood up for something and we put something on the line, that's when we find out not only who we are, but who those around us are and where God is in it as well. But speaking of God, here's something interesting about these texts that we've read. Maybe you noticed this, but perhaps you didn't. But aside from 2 or 3 references by the narrator of these midwives fearing God, there is no mention. None of the characters call on God. None of them mention God, okay, as far as God being an agent in this story. Yet it's very clear that God is there, powerfully present in the workings of all of this. And so thinking of that, how do these stories that we read, how do they suggest that God usually works in our world? How do these stories sort of indicate that God works in our world? Just these first 2 little chapters, these portions. What can you say about that? How was God at work in the story of Moses there, the birth story? Kathleen?
God worked through people. God worked through those midwives. God worked through the daughter finding Moses in the bulrushes. God worked with his mother being able to care for him, and God worked with the princess then taking him. So I think God works through us.
Is that everyone? Does everyone sort of find that to be a true experience?
Maybe not.
Yeah. It's, you know, even as we've looked at the miracle stories of Jesus and the healing stories, right? We kind of constantly come back to, these are not just performative acts on the part of a supernatural magician or power broker who one-way street will just, here's your healing. It was always a mutual connected relationship, that there was a part of the person's connection, involvement in the story, in the moment, having faith often, that created the possibility for healing and growth to happen. This story is similar, that God, while incredibly present in the story, is not magically protecting Moses. It's the acts of people, and not just people, but power, like not the powerful people, women who don't have a lot of standing in this culture, you know, in that reality in Egypt. So it's God works in these kinds of ways. It's amazing, you know, to see that the beginnings of this prophet were this, and it could have gone either way, right? Could have gone a lot of different ways. Marilyn, did you have something to add?
Yes. And this is something that happens inside of me. So you were asking a bit ago, how do we know? You know, how do we know when we stand up for, or should stand
We
up?
have competing moral claims, or
Yeah. I have, through the years, become aware that I will be puzzling over something and thinking about it, and I can't figure it out. And all of a sudden, there will be an idea that just comes into my mind. That's absolutely, I know right away, oh yeah, okay, that's what I want to do. And I don't believe those ideas come from me. They are in me, and it's my brain and everything that's doing the work. But I think that those ideas come from the divine.
Yeah. Even the act of, say, clearing your mind, of clearing the pathways of struggle and blockage and all this, and just opening yourself and then allowing that to maybe come about, to do those kinds of things. That is part of your contribution, to allow that sort of connection to, call it divine, call it the greater consciousness, something more to arrive and to arise. And so it once again speaks to the relationship, that is not just, you know, God sort of smacking us on the head and doing everything for us. And it's never like that. It's much more reliant. And in that sense, it may be much more tenuous, that these things are not a guarantee, that it did take risk, real risk, you know, that's what it asks of us. And in the face of that risk, what's our charge? What are we asked to do? That's something we constantly must reflect on. You know, as Horty said, it's not a black and white answer. There's yes and no to that, but to constantly be in tune and connected to the way that those kind of conversations and those questions and the invitation to risk is part and parcel to what it means to be a person of God, a follower of Jesus. That's what it means. Horty?
When you were speaking, the word that came up for me, well, first of all, you began earlier in our conversation today talking about relationship and relationship with God. And the word that came up for me as you were talking was, when I remain or seek to be in alignment with God, in relationship with God, my choices usually are a whole lot better than if I don't seek that guidance somewhat actively. If I just think I'm doing something because I have to, or I feel pressured or whatever, if I say, wait a minute, if I'm in relationship with God at this time, how might I behave in a way that's differently than if I don't remain in that alignment?
It's so true. The language that the story uses in terms of those two midwives, it's like, it says, because they feared the Lord, they acted in the way they did. And it just asks us to consider, okay, how is the fear of the Lord different than the fear that Pharaoh seeks to impose? Right? What do you think it means when you say fear of the Lord in this instance? What is that conveying? What does it mean to fear the Lord?
To me, it's
Kathleen?
always meant holding tightly, dearly in my heart. It has not meant fear as we often mean fear. It's never felt like that to me.
Right. Not wielded over us like a finger
Always been
wagging.
A form of dedication within my heart.
Okay. Kathleen?
I was thinking that it really means to pay attention.
Mhm.
Yeah, to pay attention, to give ourselves to devote ourselves to, in the face of all other competing interests, to trust that one. So there's a connection when it says fear of the Lord. There's a deep connection to trust of the Lord. Okay, to really giving ourselves to that, to paying attention to God above all the other things that are trying to command our attention. Yeah, that's a different motivation, isn't it? And it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Horty, and others of you too. When we tune into that, when we try to clear the barriers, clear the space, open ourselves to that movement, we tend to find ourselves in better alignment because we're not operating out of our fear in the worldly sense, but out of our trust in God. Look, there's no guarantees, but we tend to move in those ways when we give ourselves to that approach. And it's very risky, and we are sometimes asked to put ourselves on the line. And that's what this story is all about. Look at how many people put themselves on the line. In fact, name all the people who put themselves on the line in this story that we read, if possible. If you want to look at it, fine, but just who put themselves on the line? Obviously, the two midwives did. Who else?
Pharaoh's sister.
Actually, that wasn't Pharaoh's sister. That was Moses' sister. Moses' sister.
Moses' sister.
Yes, yes, Moses' sister. Absolutely.
She
I
suggested
think
this.
Yeah.
And
even
Moses'
Moses' mom to make that decision.
Yes, Moses' mom. Exactly. She is part of this too, because that was all orchestrated. The whole sister going back and getting a woman to nurse. It was Moses' own mother. So yes, the mother is one that took a risk too. Anyone else?
Pharaoh's daughter.
Pharaoh's daughter. Absolutely. Absolutely. She knew it was a Hebrew baby. And she
Maybe
said, "Oh,
even the Pharaoh himself, because I bet you this was not secret, you know.
Oh, that's an interesting point. I don't know.
I don't either.
Pharaoh is taking lots of risks to try to find a way to kind of make it to keep the overall peace. I don't know. It's interesting. He's not given a lot of there's not a lot of places to connect to Pharaoh in this story yet. He's just sort of barking commands as the way he comes across. And what strikes me is the example of his daughter is one that's very much like your example, Kathleen, and probably like all of our examples, where Pharaoh was the competing moral claim in her head. And that baby, if you notice the story, go back and look at it. When does her heart get turned? When she opens that and the baby is crying. A human, real in front of her, changes her whole heart, her whole outlook. And that's where she operates from. And that's where God can enter in. So that's kind of what it's impressing upon us. When we seek to do God's will and to follow in God's way, it will tend to be through our heart more than through our head. Now, it doesn't mean we avoid using our head, not at all. It just means too often we're operating out of the places of fear and what we're told and orders and all that, you know, instead of doing what is called for and what is needed and what is right in those moments. Okay, so it's pretty clear then. You can think of these stories as like, what if it hadn't been for Shiphrah and Puah, then what would have happened? If it hadn't been for the actions of Moses' mother and sister, what would have happened? If it hadn't been for Pharaoh's daughter, what would have happened? Do you see the pattern here? It is tenuous And God relies on us to be there for and with God in order for the ways of God to be fulfilled. Okay. God is never trying to do it all for us, but God relies on us to stand up at times. Okay. And relies on the ones that are not expected in a lot of instances. So none of us is it gets off scot-free. God will call all of us. Okay. And that is a wonderful thing. And it's a darn scary thing. I think we understand that. And if you don't understand that, then just wait. Just wait. It'll happen. And I think even talking like this may well put us in position to notice when it's happening, maybe a little differently than we have if we hadn't experienced that before. But the nature of our call and our relationship with God is that God needs us and God will utilize us to accomplish God's ways. Questions or comments about that? Bertie and then Bonnie.
We haven't yet said that God rewarded the midwives for honoring him. No.
Right. Yeah. That they had, I forget what it said, something about had like healthy, fruitful families that came out of that, right? Or something along those lines. Yeah. That there was a reward for that. But it's interesting because that doesn't seem to have been their motivation.
No,
the way the
I
story,
didn't
yeah,
expecting that.
It's like that's sort of after, but yeah, they operate out of a true, the way the story is presented, out of a true sort of heart, because they said, no, this is wrong, and we're going to stand up. And so, yeah, God does, in that sense, reward the taking of risks for the sake of love. Anyone else? Oh, Bonnie, you had your hand up.
The story that the midwives told to Pharaoh was really laughable. I'm like, this guy bought that? You know, I mean, and
I think you're on it. I think it is laughable.
I mean, I'm thinking, you know, did he know better and just sort of went along with it? Or was he really that dumb? Or was just medical knowledge of, not even medical, I mean, just life experience. I mean, babies have been being born for a long time. And
exactly. No, I think you're on it. And this is one of those examples where humor, I think, is absolutely intended. It's a bit like how a political cartoon functions. I think they are trying to make Pharaoh look like a jackass.
I don't think that men were allowed to be in the same room. So I think he's ignorant.
He may well be ignorant, exactly. But the point is, he is this one who's supposed to be in charge and all aware and everything like that. And he accepts this sort of really ridiculous story. Because I agree with you. I think it is like, what? Seriously? They just can pop them out like that just because they're so strong. Look, it certainly makes it's a very positive image for Israel. And it also functions as something that is a kind of a quiet little undercutting of this Pharaoh in his all-powerfulness. Okay, it functions that way, but it's a wonderful little tidbit, but it's also that much more risky because it's so ridiculous. It's like, wow, they use that. But think of your own life. How many times have you told a whopper and then you were like, oh my gosh, they bought that? Something like that. You know, it happens, but the risk is there. And, you know, when you do that, you are running this. And if you get caught with that, man, you're going to face the music. And that's part of this too. Okay. The story is not about, you know, the waiting for that to happen, or, you know, well, what if that? It doesn't really function that way. All the story is focused on is there's something that's necessary here. And by taking risks for love, maybe understanding that consequences could happen, absolutely. But you gotta step forward and take risks for love. And when you do that, God works. Things happen. Okay. And it doesn't make it all easy. You know, they were still enslaved, you know, after, you know, there's still lots of other things happening. It doesn't make it all gravy. when we do that, okay? But it allows God's way and God's path to be formed, to be formed in the world and to be formed in us, okay? And that's what it's trying to cultivate, trusting God first and most as we move through the difficult decisions of our lives, because that's how God works. You know, so we talk about this story is enmeshed in the themes of courage, of fear, and of trust. And those themes throughout scripture are the biggest ones. How many times does it say fear not or be not afraid in the entire canon? I mean, it says it all the time. So it's this continuing thread, okay? And we know in our humanity how difficult it is to stand up with courage and trust in the face of our fear. We know how difficult that is. And that's why we have texts like this one from Isaiah that I want to read to you now, okay? As a source, as something to maybe chew on this week as you face whatever God asks of you this week. I'm going to read this to you. If you'd like to read it, I'm going to pull it up on the screen. So if you want to read it along with me, you can. But I also invite you maybe just to close your eyes and really listen and let it sink in relation to all that we've talked about today. And this knowing that God calls us to risk sometimes. And how do we trust this? Can we trust it? And we'll offer this as a reflection point for the coming week. So this is from Isaiah chapter 43, and it's just portions of the first 4 verses. But now, says the Lord, the one who created you, Jacob, the one who formed you, Israel, don't fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When through the rivers, they won't sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you won't be scorched, and flame won't burn you. I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. Because you are precious in my eyes, you are honored, and I love you. I give people in your place and nations in exchange for your life. Isaiah is speaking to a people in exile. At this point of Isaiah, it is the Babylonian exile. And he is very encouraging, and he's using these themes of their greatest story, the story of the Exodus, to embolden them to make difficult choices. So this week, like I said, as you face whatever it is, reflect on that, especially when the risks and the challenges arise, and just notice if and how words like that, and again, it'll be printed for you if you want to revisit it, but how do words like that make a difference? Do they make a difference in how you choose to move through your challenges and your decisions? That is what I have for our class today. But before we close, are there any questions or points that we didn't get to that you maybe had something you wanted to bring up? Any remaining stuff that we didn't address, or anything else that you'd like to consider? There's a lot of material, and we'll be going through, the whole course of what Moses did, at least in terms of how it's expressed mostly in Exodus. So thanks for jumping in to the waters then, and seeing how this remarkable character, how he speaks to us, how he encourages, inspires us maybe, and certainly challenges us in his story and in the people around him that really helped him become who he was. Without all of this happening, Moses wouldn't have happened. Okay.
Marcia had her hand up for a second.
Oh, I didn't see. Sorry, where is it? Oh, Marcia, go ahead. And then I think I see Boyce too. Thank you.
Well, it's small, but I think it's when you were saying, without these women, these midwives, without the daughter, without the mother, without the prince, they were all women. And I just thought, I think in a patriarchal society that this was written in, I think that speaks volumes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is intentional. There is no will of human beings, or in this case, will of man, that can circumvent the will of and the way of God. So yeah, it's very important, I think, to notice that. And we see that theme throughout the New Testament stories as well, the Jesus stories, and throughout the Paul literature. Women have crucial roles, and in many ways, the most important roles that allow the story to continue to move forward. I mean, look at the genealogy story of Jesus, the stories of Hagar and Rahab and all these women that in these crucial moments made the decisions that allowed the heroes to continue, the bloodlines to continue, the reality of the possibility of Israel to continue. This is part of that. This is within that tradition. That this great prophet of Moses was allowed to be because of the actions of people you would perhaps least expect to be the agents, the heroic agents in the story. And it's important that we see them and notice them. And I think that's one of the things we've gotten to find today, that, wow, these characters, I didn't realize how crucial they were. They are not ancillary. They're not just bit pieces that tell a cute story about Moses' birth. No, they are heroes forwarding the story of God to allow Moses to step in and become the one that God calls him to be. It's amazing. It's amazing. Was it Boyce that also had his hand up? I think so. Go ahead.
To me, the story is just another example. Every person just did the right thing. And it's a story of do the right thing. And yes, there's potential of risks whenever you do the right thing, but do it anyway.
Well, do the God thing, and the right thing is the thing for love, because the right thing, gosh, for some people, they would look at this and say, no, the right thing would have been to follow the law and the rules. We get that too. So in this case, it's the love thing. It's sort of, and it's also seeing that each of us is capable of doing the right thing. Before he was able to do the right thing, Samwise, Frodo's best friend in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, he didn't know he could be a hero. He just wanted to go back home and be quiet and safe and eat, like most of us. We discover, though, our potential to be heroes when we take risks and step outside of our perceived limitation. And that's exactly what these stories are showing us. So let's take those words of Isaiah and step outside of ourselves and see what kind of heroes we can be this week. And I'd love to hear what that looked like for you, because being a hero doesn't mean you're going to go march out in front of something and lead people down. It might be, but being a hero might be something completely different. Don't try to define it. Open yourself up to it and see what happens. So I look forward to seeing what came up for you. You up for that? Awesome. I am too. Friends, this is great. Thank you as well, as always, for your participation, your hearts, your awesome questions. I look forward to next week. The readings for next week are printed, but I'll just say them as well now. It's Exodus 2, verses 11 to 25, 3, verses 1 to 22, and 4, verses 1 to 17. It's a lot, I understand, but you'll see why. We're going to cover a lot of stuff next week. But until then, thank you again, and be well.
Well, thank you, Dan.
You're so welcome. I love this. Take care, everyone.
Totally wonderful, totally amazing. Thanks for your risk.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.